Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wes Express, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wesexpress.com.
Also by Dan Andriacco Mysteries, featuring Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody. Their new second case book called Murderer's Row is here, featuring stories around the holidays. More information at danandriacco.com.
And by MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them online at mxpublishing.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 203, the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast about Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And boy, Burt, it's not often we get to talk about a podcast on a podcast.
It's great to spend time talking about a podcast that isn't ours.
Yes, it is. It is. And what a great podcast it is. Well, more about that in just a moment. But first, we just wanted to remind you that if you want the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/ihose203, all lowercase. That'll take you to our homepage, well, to our website, and our homepage, of course, is ihearofsherlock.com. There you can ruffle around, you can find other articles, you can comment on this one, you can subscribe to email updates and make sure that you never miss something that comes from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Rate us, review us, support us on PayPal or Patreon. Your heart's content is available there at ihearofsherlock.com. We do appreciate your support. We appreciate the listens, and thank you for joining us. If this is your first show after the Clive Marison episode, I know we have a lot of new listeners because of that. So welcome and buckle in. And one quick programming note, we do have a special quiz coming up right after the interview. It's called Canonical Couplet, and it is the Sherlockian quiz that we do in every episode where you get a chance to win a piece of Sherlockian memorabilia. Stay tuned just after the interview for your chance to win. Well, we are pleased to be able to welcome two, I wouldn't call them competitors, I would call them colleagues in the podcasting world, Gus and Luke Holwerda. Gus had his directorial debut in 2013 in The Unbelievers, an avant-garde documentary which examined the growing rift between science and religions in the world. It premiered in Toronto to sold-out screenings and, as you would imagine, polarized reviews. The film featured renowned scientists Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, Sam Harris, and Lawrence Krauss, along with enthusiastic celebrities like Ricky Gervais, Sarah Silverman, Woody Allen, Cameron Diaz, and Werner Herzog. Upon its release, The Unbelievers was the #1 documentary on iTunes and Amazon in the U.S., U.K., Ireland, and other regions worldwide. Gus's follow-up film was a Lovecraftian sci-fi thriller called Intersect, and it seeks to reinvent the time travel genre, and it is scheduled for release any time now. Gus also produces the Origins podcast on iTunes, It's rated in the top 5% of all podcasts on iTunes. And Origins features in-depth conversations exploring the importance of science in culture, as you would expect following his film The Unbelievers. He's got interviews with Ricky Gervais, Noam Chomsky, Brian May of Queen, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Fry, and many others. And of course, Gus is one half of the team of the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast. His brother Luke Holwerda is a founding member of Black Chalk Productions, and Luke brings years of industry experience and a striking visual style to Intersect. Making his feature film debut in 2013 with this controversial documentary, The Unbelievers, Luke began his career as a well-known concert photographer, working closely with artists like Queen, U2, Green Day, Kiss, and publishing in magazines like Spin. As a producer, Luke helped to craft the unique look and feel of Intersect, while also playing the guiding role behind the scenes of the film's day-to-day production. Luke is, as I said, the other co-host of the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast, and also on Origins podcast as well. Gus and Luke, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Thanks for having us.
Now, just so we get voices straight in our heads, which one of you is Gus and which one is Luke?
The one that sounds like Gus is Gus.
Perfect.
This one over here is Luke.
Excellent. Okay. Everybody got that? Okay, we're ready to go. Well, we typically start our episodes, as you probably know, asking our guests how they first came to meet with Sherlock Holmes and what format, and to describe the scenario for us. So, Gus, why don't we start with you? How did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
You know, I think my grandmother, when I was about 8 years old, gave me a Penguin paperback of A Study in Scarlet. And looking back on it, I don't have that book anymore. I wish I did. But I don't think it was actually the Conan Doyle tale. You know what I mean? I think it was like a young reader book that was adapted. I'm not totally sure about that. But that was my introduction. I still remember how destroyed I made that book after reading it a couple of times and getting my hair gel all over it on accident once upon a time. But yeah, that was my introduction. And then from there, I kind of just ate everything up. I was a child of the 80s, so I really enjoyed the Granada series, obviously, but also young Sherlock Holmes and some of the stuff that came later.
Oh, and how about you, Luke?
For me, I mean, we are brothers, so we cross paths quite a bit in the family home. But for me personally, it was more the Granada series was the first starting point, because Gus watched it and my dad watched it and everybody in the family watched it on Masterpiece Theater on PBS.
Yeah.
And I think it was a little bit slower for me. You know, I kind of gradually got into it, but eventually it became something we just watched and watched and watched and watched. And that's kind of where the podcast came from.
Well, and when did you pick up the books after first seeing the show, Luke?
I would have guessed it was somewhere in elementary school. I read Hound of the Baskervilles for school, and that was, I think, was always one of the big stories you read as a kid, and it made an impression. But for some reason, that's one of the episodes. Excuse me. That's one of the stories I always forget. I always forget how it ends, no matter how many times I've read it. But that's kind of the kickoff point for me. And then my dad gave me the big Baring Gould bound annotated book. Gus and I both have a copy from our dad, actually.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like your dad was a big Sherlockian.
You know, he wasn't, I wouldn't call him a Sherlockian. He definitely loved the Jeremy Brett series and was the one who introduced us to it. And I remember, you know, being very young and watching it on actually a black and white TV, because we were pretty broke growing up. We still had a black and white TV in the 80s, which I wish we still had that TV. But anyway, we watched the show there in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where we grew up for a few years. And but he really liked it. He loved Jeremy Brett. He had a love of his method and his mannerisms and all the little, you know, things he would do, drop to the floor and act like a sleuth hound. And it was kind of he really enjoyed that performance. And I think it just rubbed off, you know, same genes, I guess.
Now, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, that's not too far from where the Valley of Fear took place.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we've lived in a lot of places where Sherlock Holmes has had adventures. We've had run-ins with. Well, we're in Arizona now, so very close to the Mormon capital, but we've been there once or twice in our travels as well.
And got to watch out for those avenging angels.
Yes, exactly.
Oh. Now, which of you is the older brother? Which of you is the Mycroft in this relationship?
That's me. That's Gus.
Okay. And what's the age difference between you guys?
Well, it depends on how old we are.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how old you are, Luke.
I think I'm 39.
No.
Or 38. One of the two.
Yeah, I think it's about 7 years. 7 years difference.
Well,
yeah.
see, just like Sherlock and Mycroft. That's perfect.
Right.
That explains way too much.
And we're just
here.
like them. That's what's so weird about it.
Yeah, exactly. I do the snuff, and Luke does. No, I'm just kidding.
That's great. So, obviously, it sounds like you had parallel interests when you were kids. You obviously have a parallel path now with the podcast. But talk a little bit about what you do in real life and how that kind of has a parallel path as well.
Well, actually, something, Gus and I never even talk about anymore is we started a band together. And I think that's partly how Gus and I, there's six kids in our family. And I think that's how Gus and I got closer, is just through the music, And that went on for a couple of years. And then that kind of turned into photography and then video and then making music videos for other bands.
Was that the Speckled Band? Sorry.
Speckled Band. No, we had a different name. But it kind of just kept growing. It just kept changing into different things that we would work on together. And it all kind of came from the band. But then eventually we got into film and doing, short films ourselves, and then wanting to do our own feature and then documentaries. And now we do commercials and whatever else comes around. And, I don't know if that really answers it, but
from there, we did end up making our first feature film, which is a movie called Intersect, but Intersect got put on hold because we had an opportunity to make our second feature film, which is one called The Unbelievers. And that was a documentary that kind of traveled all around the world and had some interesting people in it, which we could talk about if we want to. Ricky Gervais and Sarah Silverman and Tim Minchin and Woody Allen and Werner Herzog. I can't even think of everybody that appeared in it. But
Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, I always forget Stephen Hawking. He's so unimpressive, that guy, But but yeah, and then after that one was done, we had a few things developing in Hollywood, which took up a lot of our time. But we decided to come back to Intersect just recently, actually, and finish it and go ahead and put it out, even though it's at this point 10 years old. But it feels good to be done with it and kind of have it off our plate so that we can devote all our time to the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast. I'm being slightly facetious only.
No, but it's been a weird trip for us because Intersect was something like I said, we weren't sure if we were going to release it because we kept getting onto these new projects and it was hard to go backwards. But we finally finished it and said, okay, let's put it out, let's do the best we can with it. And currently at the moment, over the weekend, we went number 1 in horror on iTunes and we're in the top 10. So we're like, well, maybe it's a good idea.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about it. What is Intersect all about?
It is a strange little item, I'll tell you that. It was an attempt to do something totally creative, totally ambitious, way too ambitious for our first movie, if we're being honest. But it's a time travel, Lovecraftian, sci-fi, thriller, puzzle movie of sorts. And if that's not enough adjectives, then what it is it's a movie that's kind of told in reverse about a scientist who invents a time machine, and everything goes totally wrong. But what happens is you see the story unfold in reverse, and what you start to realize is that there are things that are moving kind of backwards through time with the story, whereas the story itself would be moving forward through time if you were watching it. But more than that, you start to see characters appearing in the past from the future, and the movie goes all the way back to when the main characters were children. So then you start seeing the adults from the future interacting with the children from the past, and I'm spoiling a lot, but really, it's quite a lot. It's quite an ambitious thing, and honestly, it's a micro budget indie labor of love kind of movie. So, we're extremely proud of it for what it was 10 years ago, and we're so happy that it's out now. And it's been frankly amazing to see that it's made its way into the charts at all on iTunes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It strikes a familiar chord. I don't know if you guys have ever read anything by Piers Anthony, but he did a series of it began as a series of 5 books called The Incarnations of Immortality. And the first one was about death. It was called On a Pale Horse. And effectively, every character was a human who occupied an office for a while. In that case, it was the office of death. And, it got handed off from one person to another. So that hence the incarnation of immortality. And the second book was called Bearing an Hourglass, and it was about time. And the interesting thing about time is he traveled backwards. And the same kind of thing with Intersect. You see characters that you've come across before, but in a different context and, kind of reversed in terms of the action. So fantastic.
That sounds really cool, actually. I have not read that, but it sounds great.
Yeah, I highly recommend those first 5 books in the series are excellent.
That's great. We another hat that we wear is we produce another podcast called The Origins Podcast, which is kind of a science and culture thing, but again, lots of famous guests come on and talk about how much they love science and culture. But during one of our run-ins with one of those guests, I was telling the author Neil Stevenson about Intersect. It hadn't come out yet. And he said, let me know when it comes out because that gives me an idea and I don't want to steal yours. So I haven't actually gotten back to him yet. Yeah, I know. We need to do that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break here. We're talking with Gus and Luke Holwerda from the Sherlock Holmes Jeremy Brett podcast. When we come back, we'll get to the meat of the conversation. That's why you're here, talking about Jeremy Brett. Stay tuned. Well, since we're talking about Jeremy Brett in this episode, it seems only appropriate to focus on a Jeremy Brett project that MX Publishing put out. I recall that earlier this year they mounted a Kickstarter for a book, a biography of Jeremy Brett that was, like no other. It's by Maureen Whitaker with a foreword by David Burke, and it's called Playing a Part. The Kickstarter was oversubscribed, well supported, and now the book is available as a color hardback edition from MX Publishing.
The lovely thing about this is, of course, Maureen Whitaker, the author, is a lifelong fan of Jeremy Brett. And what a career. You would need a lifelong fan, someone who has really covered and understood Jeremy Brett's life to put together a book that takes you through his decades of work on stage. He was played Dracula, William Pitt, the younger, Freddie Eynsford Hill in My Fair Lady, and created the definitive performance of Holmes. At least many of us feel that way. And so, it's a wonderful way to honor his career, and it's absolutely fascinating and full of information all about a very unique and talented man.
Indeed, and filled with lots of photographs from Jeremy's career as well, both black and white and color. 468 pages worth of biographical information about Jeremy Brett. As Bonnie McBird, our colleague from the Baker Street Irregulars and noted author, wrote, I loved this book. It's a thrill ride and a suitable way to honor the remarkable career of a courageous, gifted gentleman. Twinkle on, Jeremy. Find this book and many others like it at mxpublishing.com. All right, we are back talking with Gus and Luke, and now we want to get to what everyone has been waiting for. So you mentioned having an interest in Jeremy Brett, the Granada series as a kid, watching it on PBS. Do you remember, by the way, the wonderful introductions that Vincent Price and then Diana Rigg used to do?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, in our podcast, I thought about including those in every episode, just because I feel like a lot of people probably don't know those ever existed, especially the young generation coming to the show who see it on Blu-ray or on BritBox or whatever. They would never really know those introductions ever existed, but they were neat. They were magical. I decided not to put them in the show just because, I don't know, it seemed to disjoint it from the main, core of what we were going to be talking about. But they're neat, and they're on YouTube, so you can find them and watch them. They're neat.
But that's a good point, because I don't know if the British audiences ever saw those.
No, they didn't.
True.
Those were made just for PBS.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean that kind of changes, I think, our view on the show. It kind of added to it in a different weird way. I mean, and the music of Masterpiece Theater in that way too. Very, very bizarre, kind of scary music when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, well, those introductions were actually written by some members of the Baker Street Irregulars. Dan Poznansky provided a lot of the information about Conan Doyle and a lot of the set decorations in the Vincent Price setup there.
Oh, very cool. Was Vincent Price a member of the Baker Street Irregulars?
He was not, although obviously we were known to him and he to us, but I don't think he ever made his way to a dinner as far as I can recall. Bert, do you have any personal knowledge of Vincent Price and the Baker Street Irregulars?
No, we never crossed paths with Vincent Price, although, in his career, he crossed paths, in direct connections to Sherlock, but no, he was never engaged.
Yeah. Well, we did have
things to do.
We did have Douglas Wilmer as a member. He, of course, was Sherlock Holmes on the BBC in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And, of course, in Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother. Isaac Asimov. Bert knew Isaac pretty well.
Yeah. That's great.
So we've had a few run-ins. And now I think one of our most famous members, well, we have a few. Neil Gaiman, of course, which you guys probably know. Les Klinger, I know you quote Les from his new annotated Sherlock Holmes. Les has also written the annotated Lovecraft as well.
Yes, I love it.
So he makes his way in a lot of circles. And then, of course, Curtis Armstrong, known to millions of fans around the world as Booger from Revenge of the Nerds, as well as a number of other things. And he's just a great treat. So, we have these luminaries that kind of add to our proceedings and provide lots of different perspectives on things. So Vincent Price was not there. But, I mentioned the set and the set design there because we see a lot of those artifacts at the annual meeting of the Speckled Band of Boston, where Dan is I guess he's the cheetah now. He's the keeper. He brings, the Gasogene and Tantalus and Persian slippers and things and sets them up on the table and the mantelpiece and things like that. So you guys would feel right at home in a setting like that, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when did you decide, obviously you had this burning love of the Granada series. When did you sit back and say to yourselves, Gus, Luke, I think it's time we start a podcast about the Jeremy Brett series?
I don't know exactly when it was, but I guess it was, it must have been a little over a year ago because we just reached our anniversary, but I seem to remember it was around Christmas time that I was watching the Blue Carbuncle episode, which I tend to do every Christmas, and thinking to myself, this podcast space is so, ripe, and I think we were working on the Origins podcast at the time, and it just felt like there wasn't one out there that was really just completely devoted to the Granada series. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could be the ones to kind of spearhead that and do it the way that, that I would like to do it, which, taking a nod from, other podcasts out there. One that influenced me a great deal was the Twilight Zone podcast with Tom Elliott, where he kind of uses the clips, dives into the backstory, and does a little bit of history and research on it. Ours is different in the sense that we also add the conversational element, But I just knew that if I did this podcast without Luke, that he would hate me forever. So I thought we'll do the conversational part and kind of make that even more meaty than the show coverage part, and that way, hopefully bring some things to light that maybe people hadn't noticed before. Especially because we're film nerds and we tend to look at all the details from the lens point of view. And so, I don't know, it just kind of came about pretty quickly, actually. I think I cranked out the first one and said, Luke, let's record. And he said, let's do it. So we did.
Yeah, we used to just call each other. We would watch the same episodes, and then we'd call each other and have these 2-hour phone calls. And we thought, we should just record this. I mean, if this doesn't already exist, maybe people would be interested in hearing this, especially, speaking of the film side. And Gus is more of an expert on the stories than I am, so he takes that side.
Well, it's one of the things that makes your podcast so special, because you're coming to this not only as film nerds, but you're a director, Luke's a cinematographer, and it's a lovely balance. Your podcast has got a lovely balance between the conversation and the commentary.
Well, I'd like to think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say. Well, I'd like to think that another little thing that we bring to our podcast is that we are certainly not experts. So, I kind of embrace the fact that we learn as we go, and so I have a familiarity with the stories. I've read them all, of course, multiple times, but I certainly haven't dug as deep as some other podcast hosts on this program have. So, I like to think we're looking at it with fresh eyes, and I hope that kind of our audience, I think a lot of the TV fan audience of the Granada series probably are the same way. They probably enjoyed the show. Maybe they've read the stories, but they haven't dug super deep. And so, if we can give them the first toe into the water of diving deeper into the stories, I think that's what I like to do. That's what I like to try to do anyway.
Well, you're setting a great example. I remember I was like this before, because I'm older, so I was like this with the Rathbone films that I would see on television.
Yeah.
And so many of my relationships that I established when I was in college, because these things were on TV, if I found somebody who knew who Dennis Hoey was, he played, for our listeners, he played Inspector Lestrade in the Universal series. But if I found someone who knew, the names of the character actors that were in this sort of Rathbone Bruce stock company. And that's the lovely thing about your podcast, because you get into it. It's all the stuff you like to do on Google if you were watching one of these episodes and you mentioned,
right.
You used to call each other for 2 hours. Let's go over to IMDb and what else was this guy in and where was he born? And,
yeah.
And it's just, it's terrific. So you're setting a great example.
Well, and we've been lucky enough to also do some traveling through different jobs that we've been a part of, and that took us to London and the surrounding areas on multiple occasions, where we were able to also visit the locations from some of these episodes, which, it's like Mecca for us. We're just the super fans, and it's so neat to go visit some of those places. Have you guys ever done that? Have you been able to get out of the country and visit some locations?
Me, only I've been to London and Cornwall and Stratford. I lived in Europe for a while, but I never was able to, because I was working so, my job was so intense at the time that taking time off to actually go into the country and find a specific location I couldn't do. But I used to do the walks.
Yeah.
I used to walk around town and find where this was shot and that was shot. And I was in Oxford once when they were still shooting John Thaw and Kevin Whately were still shooting Inspector Morse, and I remember stumbling onto the crew in the Jaguar as they were shooting, bits of. In fact, I kept bumping into them all weekend. They were in cafes, they were taking the car around town, they were doing a variety of
Yeah, and I've had a chance to go to London and Oxford a number of times, but haven't gone out to the countryside to see some of those sites. I've done the Sherlock Holmes Society of London walks. I think there's 4 different walks you can do in town that take you through actual locations in the stories. And you know, I mean, you get a sense as to what the setting looked like and where they might have shot certain things, but certainly never had a chance to go to Manchester or, you know, out to the moors or any of the countryside that they visited. We've chronicled where some of those places are on our website, but boy, to be there, this is like the early Sherlockians when Conan Doyle was still alive and London hadn't been bombed, when they went and actually tried to determine where 221B Baker Street was. What was the inspiration for it? Because Upper Baker Street didn't exist at the time. So they were down in like the 90s and the hundreds, 110s, kind of trying to pinpoint where this brownstone was before everything got wrecked. So it seems to be one of those activities that just keeps people that are interested in Sherlock Holmes going back for more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are such nerds. I mean, I don't know how, we've been to London a handful of times, and I'm pretty sure every time we always go to the Sherlock Holmes Museum. We know it's nerdy, and we know it's a tourist trap, but we just go anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how could you be in London and not go to Baker Street? Sure.
Exactly.
That's right. And the Sherlock Holmes pub and, you know, all the usual places.
Exactly.
And I don't know if it's still there because I know they remodeled the pub, but there was a portrait for which one of your podcast hosts posed that was on the wall up there hanging opposite the Conan Doyle portrait. So
really interesting. Well, we'll have to look for that next
time. So for people who haven't had a chance to listen to your show yet, and I would imagine that's very few people, explain to us, kind of bring us through what an episode is like, to take us through the cadence and what people would expect when they tune in.
The show is comprised of two parts. The first part is kind of an episode recap, where we use clips and music from the show. But more than that, what we try to do is research as well as we can with the materials that are available, kind of all the behind-the-scenes stuff that you would sure love to see on a Blu-ray commentary track or something, but since none of that really exists, that's what we do. And we kind of dig into the memoirs of Michael Cox and the Peter Haining television Sherlock Holmes book, and Bending the Willow and the other books by David Stewart Davies, and just kind of any of the ones that are really specific to the creation of the show, and try to pick out, you know, the best bits of trivia, the most revealing behind-the-scenes things that kind of get you into the mindset of what it was like to be on the show at the time. And especially from Jeremy Brett's point of view, I think in the very first episode of the podcast, I said something like, you know, the focus is going to be on Mr. Brett's portrayal. And that really is what it's meant to be. It's you know, he's just such a fascinating person and has such an amazing story and such talent. So we really want to shine a light on that and his thoughts as much as we can collect them from the show as it progressed. But once we get past the recap part of the show, then Luke and I go into a discussion about it, kind of bring up our own memories and our favorite bits and our not so favorite bits, and any other researches that we found. And one thing we tend to do in that portion of the show is dive into the annotated books, the Les Klinger book and the Baring Gould and whichever other ones we have laying around at the time. And this is a question I actually have for you guys, because we tend to get really sidetracked by all the annotations, especially the ones that are more, specific to the game, and the ones that aren't really like historical tidbits about Conan Doyle or Sherlock Holmes or London, but more like side theories. And I'm curious, you guys, I'm sure, have spent a lot of time with those books. What are your thoughts on that in terms of an annotation? Do you guys appreciate the ones that dive deep into, whether Mycroft was actually working with Moriarty, or do you find those, because we find those to be, on the laughable side sometimes? I mean, they're fun and they're entertaining, but I always am wondering, why Mr. Baring Gould had decided to put those into the annotated books. I'm curious your take on that.
Well, there's a number of reasons. I mean, one, no one had annotated anything before Baring Gould came along. And he was full on in the annotations game. He had done the annotated Alice in Wonderland. I think the annotated Mother Goose. He was the Les Klinger of his time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure when Les hears that, he'll be take that as a huge compliment. Because really Les Klinger is like the William Baring Gould of our time. And the world of Sherlockian scholarship was really only about 20 to 30 years old at that point. So there really wasn't a lot of material to work with compared to what we have today. And a lot of it was hidden away. It was locked away in these books that didn't have a large print volume. It was hidden away in the Baker Street Journal, which didn't have a large circulation at the time. It still doesn't have a huge circulation, but these were secrets that were locked up within the world of Sherlockians. So he felt it was his duty and opportunity to bring some of those theories forward. He was driven by his own theories, obviously, his own sense of chronology. And there are probably 20 or so chronologists that have tried their hand at this over the course of the years. But he had a very specific eye toward things. Now, in the late 1990s, along came a new set, a very handsome 9-volume set called the Oxford Sherlock Holmes. And this, I think Owen Dudley Edwards was the general editor. He was from Edinburgh, and it had a very specific Conan Doyle slant to it. So, and here's the other thing: the annotations weren't within the text; they were really endnotes. So they weren't a distraction at all. You actually had to kind of put a finger in the back of the book and remember where you were. But they were more historical, more associated with what Conan Doyle was doing at that time in his life, and are more, I would say, scholarly than the fanciful kind of things that we see from Baring Gould.
Yeah. Well, you've sold me. I'm buying that as soon as I can.
The only thing that I would add about annotations is you have to sort of understand how it started. You mentioned, Gus, that this for you began on Christmas when you would see the Blue Carbuncle every year. Years ago, Chris Morley, the guy who founded the Baker Street Irregulars, wrote a long essay about the Blue Carbuncle. And Morley, like Baring Gould, Morley was born in 1890, and so Conan Doyle was alive for a lot of his life. But in his essay, he sort of wrote to Baker Street Irregulars and asked them indirectly to explain some of the things the older generation would take for granted, but which the new generation wouldn't know. And so Morley said, for example, what's a basket chair? And he identified that. Or in the Blue Carbuncle, the pink un, the sporting paper that in his essay he said, is sort of like our police gazette.
Right.
So I think the impetus for the first wave of annotation sort of came from explaining a hansom cab and explaining this, that, and the other thing to a new generation of readers that wouldn't know what those things were. And then
I think you put your finger on it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think you put your finger on it for me, though. But I think I'm the one who's more critical about the annotations. But it's because of that reason. Like, I like reading along and going, lovely little broom, like, what is that? And I can click over and go, oh, it's this type of carriage. But the thing that gets confusing, I think, to me, I'm not a scholar, is when I'm reading these very dense explanations of like times tables off the Bradshaw, or how Watson might be Jack the Ripper. I think for a younger audience, I don't think they would jump into an annotated book, but if they did, your mind would be going all over the place as you're reading the story.
Well, this is where I think having the right tools at hand matters. When I first discovered Sherlock Holmes, it was about the same time frame as you guys. It was the mid 80s. And it was kind of concurrent, maybe within months of each other, the books first and then the Jeremy Brett series. And I caught a lot of them on USA Up All Night, where they were re-airing them too. But the only volume I had was a volume my parents had given me that went up through The Return. So you had Adventures, Memoirs, Hound, and The Return, and Sign of Four, and Study in Scarlet. So I didn't have the case book. I didn't have Valley of Fear. I didn't have His Last Bow in there. nor did I have any annotations. So here I was thinking, well, what, I'm looking at the book. I've got a dictionary from the 1960s next to me from our house, and that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I went to my first meeting with the Men on the Tour in Connecticut. And I was brought in by Tyke Niver, who I had interviewed over the phone for a high school research paper. And suddenly I see these people, and I find out there's all kinds of books. And somebody said, you have to get the Encyclopedia Sherlockiana.
Yes.
This was published in 1977 by Jack Tracy. And Jack Tracy was a member of the BSI, and he did exactly what you were asking for, Luke. He said, well, what's a brum? Or, what's the pinkin? Or, what is, coal tar derivatives, right? So anytime those weird terms popped up in the stories as you're reading them, and it was maybe a Victorian term, or maybe it was something specific to the Sherlock Holmes stories, it's there in the encyclopedia for you. Now, in addition, he also had sections where he talked about Holmes's personality, his disguises, he chronicled a lot of that stuff. And to me, it was an essential companion volume to have as I was reading an unannotated version of the stories. And it was so helpful. So when I came across the annotated years later when I went to college and perpetually checked out the copy in the school library, I was astounded, right? And that's where I started to really geek out. But it was because I had that solid footing beforehand that made it more interesting to me.
Yeah, and I actually picked up based on listening to your podcast, as a matter of fact, the Encyclopedia Sherlockiana. I picked it up when we were in New York from the Mysterious Bookshop.
There you go. It works. Yeah. Hey, Otto, that's another sale. I hope you're listening.
Maybe I should let Luke borrow that one. He can use that one as we move forward.
There you go.
Yeah, we just covered The Empty House, and there were more annotations than story. And I was going to read them all. I went through all of them, and it was mainly, dates and train schedules and how the temperature was different. Maybe Watson wasn't as cold as he said he was. Maybe he was lying, and it was like, all right.
Yeah, it's a deep dive for sure.
Yeah.
So speaking of deep dives, I've noticed that some of your episodes are a little longer than others. And now that I'm not commuting anymore, I can't get them done in one sitting. How do you guys decide how long are we going to spend on this particular episode? What's your guiding star there?
Well, it's interesting and embarrassing that you should ask that question, because I feel like these episodes are getting way too long. But I'll tell you why. So the last couple, the final problem and going into the empty house, those are particularly long because I just found that as we were putting them together, I didn't want to leave things out. I wanted to make sure that our audience, who, I don't know exactly how schooled our audience is in all things Sherlockian, but I wanted to make sure they knew the backstory of why Conan Doyle was doing what he did, and how kind of unhappy he was about the stories. And that really doesn't have anything to do with the Granada series, but I feel like it has a lot to do with the story itself. And so we spent way more time on Conan Doyle and the actual story in these last couple than we did. But on top of that, this also happened to be the time in the timeline of the Granada series when Jeremy Brett started to have his major problems. His wife passed away. He started to have his episodes with manic depression and or bipolar disorder. And it was just so much that needed to be talked about, and so I just felt it's a podcast. There's no rules. Let's just go with it. Let's just talk about everything. And so,
but on top of all that, you have David Burke leaving and Ed Harbeck coming in for the first time. So from our point of view as the TV show podcast, those were big moments in the TV show. So
yeah. There's probably not going to be together. Yeah, it's probably not going to be any bigger episodes than these moving forward, except for maybe the final ones. But that was the reason for the most recent ones. I feel like they've been creeping up in time up to this point, but I'm looking forward to getting back to a more reasonable length as we move forward.
Well, you've had Dan Andriacco on the show before, and isn't he a delightful guest, Bert?
Yes, he is a delightful guest, and he is a delight. He's a great sartorial colleague. Yes.
Yeah, he like us, enjoys the bow ties and never misses a chance. He will even throw a T-shirt on over his shirt and bow tie. Usually a Holmesian, a Sherlockian styled T-shirt. You can't seem to find Dan anywhere without a bow tie, but you can't find Dan anywhere without Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody, his crime-solving duo from Erin, Ohio. The two of them are making another appearance, this time in Murderer's Row. That's his latest book. And rather than a single novel, this is a second volume of short stories. It's an anthology of sorts. Dan says it's around the holidays, but really it's around different times to celebrate, celebratory events. Things like Independence Day, for example.
It's an Independence Day parade. But the lovely thing about this is that they're all novellas. And novellas, that's a form that Rex Stout made so popular with the Nero Wolfe stories. And so you've got three cases in Murderer's Row: a destination wedding, the annual Independence Day parade, and then a minor league baseball match. Great opportunities for Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody to show us what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, what else is there between baseball and 4th of July and wedding? I mean, it's pretty much what every American dreams of.
Hear, hear.
Well, let's hope you dream of Sebastian McCabe and Jeff Cody in your mailbox. Order soon from danandriaco.com or mxpublishing.com, and make sure you get your copy of Murderer's Row in time for the holidays. One of the things I think that has stuck out to me as a listener is we're hearing you guys geek out in general, but specifically when you talk about things like, the costuming or the props, things that you can physically touch and feel. You want to talk a little bit about your particular interests there and where it is leading or has led?
Well, I think for maybe the general public, Gus and I both wear old hats. We love old hats, old fedoras and trilbies and flat caps and all these things. And maybe that came from this series. I don't know for sure, but definitely influenced by the series. And so we spend a lot of time, maybe too much time, on hats and costumes. But then, as you say, the props as well. And that's just something, I think, from the filmmaking side that we appreciate maybe more than other people, just the time that went into those things. And for me, going to the Sherlock Museum, I always wanted to go in there and find these things. I wanted to find the Musgrave Ritual that I could frame and put on my wall. And I never did. And I've got a friend who always says, if you can't find something, maybe you need to be the one to make it. So we've started making what we're calling the Sherlockian Relics collection. But they are based on the Granada series, not on the stories. So there's a small collection that we have going right now, just things that you can touch and feel from the show, things that Sherlock would have, come across in his time. And to me, that was just something neat, and I thought other people might like it. So we're doing kind of a test run right now to see if people are interested in that. So we're starting pre-orders, and they're coming in, and we're pretty surprised.
Yeah, the interesting thing too is examining these things in the close detail that we're trying to do, because these prop replicas, and really props to Luke, no pun intended, but he's the one kind of spearheading this thing and really doing most of the work on these props. And what we've done is, screen capture things like the ritual, but you'd be surprised how you don't see a lot of these props as clearly as you might imagine you would. And so it takes a lot of work to kind of zoom in on these images and try to figure out exactly where the loops and whirls are in the written, dialogue or the written text. And, but as Luke mentioned, they're show specific. So as you guys know, they changed the ritual a bit for the show as opposed to the story. And obviously there's multiple versions even in the story, but we had to make a decision early on, which version are we going to make? Because do we want to appeal to everyone who love Sherlock Holmes that might want the Musgrave Ritual from the Oxford edition, or do we want to make the show prop, and we just decided show prop because that's what we'd like to have on our wall.
Yeah, well, I think that's fair. I mean, that's what you guys are talking about on the show. So you're true to the brand here. So,
yeah,
what are some of the other relics that you're considering making or that you're in the process of making?
So currently, we are developing the Musgrave Ritual, the contract for the Red-Headed League. The Red-Headed League is dissolved note, which just kind of goes along with it. One of the sign of four cards, one of the warning cards, the blue carbuncle, the poster for the Falls of Reichenbach that's over Jeremy's mantelpiece. And am I forgetting anything, Gus? The Devil's Foot powder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's in the current collection. But we've already started working on the next collection, and without giving away too much yet, I mean, we've been spending a lot of time trying to recreate the Napoleon bust from the show, and what we've done is, because of our listeners, they've been so wonderful and so communicative, and they've reached out to us. We've found like 2 or 3 different people who actually have busts from the Granada series in their collection. And so they've been nice enough to take tons of photographs, which we've scanned into the computer, which we are going to hopefully be able to use to make a 3D model, which we are then going to make a mold out of, which we are then going to fill with plaster and insert a little black, pearl into the bottom. Maybe not a real black pearl, but but that is going to be, that's like something I've wanted since I was 12 years old. So I'm really looking forward to that one being completed.
Well, me too. That's exactly it. The Napoleon bust and the ritual were like the 2 big things for me. And I have a Napoleon bust, but it's too small and it's too accurate to Napoleon. Like I want the one that's a little fat and globby, like I want the one from the show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. There have been folks over the course of the years that have done a lot of different relics, a lot of different things, both from the books and the shows. And probably going back, I want to say 25 years or so, there was a shop right across from where 221B Baker Street, I'm saying that in air quotes because that was actually down the street at Abbey House, where the Sherlock Holmes Museum is, which is actually 239 Baker Street. Directly across the street, there was a shop called the Sherlock Holmes Memorabilia Company.
Yeah.
And for many years, they sold a lot of things that had to do with the show, postcards, and a lot of shots of Jeremy Brett. But I think they tried their hand at a few props and relics as well. But I wanted to bring something else up because, the world of Sherlock Holmes is so weird because he is certainly known worldwide, and yet you've got this underground cult of people who are interested in him who may not even know about each other, right? So for years, there was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars and of Watson's Tin Box in Maryland, a guy by the name of Paul Churchill. You knew Paul, right, Bert?
Oh, yeah.
Paul used to he did make 60 what he called evidence boxes, and they were each made of antiques. He went out and scoured antique stores all around the world, and they were each made up of antiques that represented things that were mentioned in a particular story, and he had one box for each story. And he would bring these boxes to meetings, and he would hand them out and let people touch them and feel them. And, he would have a Musgrave ritual. He would have, the jackknife that was stuck into the mantelpiece, things like that. So it's wonderful that you guys are doing this on a commercial level that make it accessible to not only fans of the show, but people that are interested in the physical world of Sherlock Holmes as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
I have to ask, because you're also interested in Lovecraft, are there other props that fascinate you? Have you both collected other props from other things? For example, I know the Lovecraft Society has a whole bunch of paper props and finds.
Yeah. If you could see the room I'm sitting in right now, just in front of me, I have a replica of the napkin dispenser from the Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner, where he puts in.
Wow.
Yeah, I have that. I have the statue from the The Exorcist. I have. My whole room is prop replicas, so it's a passion.
I think the through point here is that we're both a little mental. I'm looking at. I've made my own replica of Brian May's guitar that he built with his father.
Yeah,
and I even went as far as to make the strap that they made out of a leather belt. We're on a weird spectrum.
Yeah,
but we're all kind of on that spectrum. I have a bunch of World War II gas mask bags from Indiana Jones, and
nice.
Both Scott and I love fedoras, and I've got a replica of the Man from Uncle Communicator and all sorts of stuff from different. I have a replica of the Maltese Falcon that I got.
See, that is something I have been meaning to buy for like 10 years, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But I love the Maltese Falcon.
Well, you have to find the captain of the ship as he keels over dead. And plunks it down in your room. That's
Captain Jack of the La Paloma.
Right. Very good.
Well, the one the official one I know you can buy still on eBay it comes wrapped in the wrapping and everything.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll get it eventually. Yeah.
But the two of you, if you haven't been, I think it's pretty safe to say you haven't. There is a triennial conference that happens in Bloomington, Indiana, called From Gillette to Brett.
Yes.
It's put on by the guys that run Wessex Press and Gassagene Books. And Steve Doyle, one half of that, and you've probably heard him on our show from time to time, he is a collector of sorts as well. His specialty is Sherlockian costumes. And he actually has a number of garments from the Granada series, including the gray overcoat, that long frock coat.
Which you had teased on our Twitter.
Yes. So, and if you come to From Gillette to Brett, he actually displays those in the vendor's room, not for anyone to buy, but just as curiosities, kind of a traveling museum of sorts. Cool. And it's wonderful to see that.
No, I first learned about that gathering through your podcast as well. And I recently, not too long ago, picked up the CD that he has available on his website of Michael Cox talking about his time on the series from back in the 80s, I guess, when he appeared at From Gillette to Brett. We've been trying to get Michael Cox to appear on our show to do an interview with us for so long. He and David Burke and June Wyndham Davies. I mean, really, those are the three that we're trying so hard to get a hold of them, and it's so difficult. We know so many people who know David Burke, and they've expressed their interest in helping us reach him, but I think he's just not. He's not talking about Sherlock Holmes right now.
Yeah, well, we've been in touch with him. He has some hearing issues as well, and we've been in touch with Michael Cox, and he has some health issues. We actually were in touch with Colin Jevons' son. See about getting Inspector Lestrade on, but he had to decline as well. Again, health and age issues. We're reaching that point now. It's 25 years after Jeremy Brett's death. And that's a good 28 years or so since the last episode was filmed. So we're 3 decades beyond the series. And the connections are getting fewer and fewer. So we do what we can. So tell us a little bit about, and I know we have a limited amount of time here left. Tell us a little bit about how you managed to get Stephen Fry to appear on your show.
So this was, again, just kind of a lucky break for us. But the other podcast we work on, the Origins podcast, it's hosted by a scientist named Lawrence Krauss, and he has a lot of famous friends. And we've gotten to know a lot of those famous friends because Lawrence was involved in our film The Unbelievers, and we've kind of made our own connections with these folks over the years. But we've also been connected with Lawrence in a lot of different ways through the university in Arizona where he was at. We did a lot of science-related filming for them and things. But long story short is that Lawrence was set to do an interview with Stephen Fry in London, and one of a series of interviews we did while we were out there. And we did that interview, which actually is just going to be released this week. And we pulled Stephen aside and said, listen, we know you are a colossal Sherlockian, Holmesian, however you would like to say it. And if you'd be willing to give us 5 minutes, we'd love to just chat with you for a second on the side. And, he ended up sitting with us for about half an hour, and he was just fantastic. I wish we could have just let the cameras roll and let everything record, because he continued we talked for much longer than the interview went on for, but he was away from the microphones already. But it was just so neat. And he's been in contact multiple times since then to talk about the podcast. And we were contemplating trying to get him for another episode more recently for the Redheaded League in the middle of lockdown, but things got crazy. And but we're hopeful that we'll be able to reconnect with him when the next Sherlock Holmes movie happens, because I think it's been made fairly public that he's reprising his role as Mycroft in that. So.
Well, see if you can put in a good word for us, because we've DM'd him a few times on Twitter, and he ended up going cold on us and completely shutting us down. So
certainly.
I know he's has issues he goes through from time to time, so want to be careful about that. But we would love to have him on the show, talk about the Audible series that he did, and obviously his role. And he also knew Richard Lancelyn Green, who was a longtime member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and a lot of people in common that we have.
Stephen Fry knows everyone.
He does, and the world of Sherlock Holmes is a small world.
Yeah, and that was exactly the thing. I think we just got lucky. We mentioned the Jeremy Brett thing. He was like, "I love Jeremy Brett," and he was like, "Did you know I knew him?" And it was like, "Oh, okay, perfect. Let's just sit down."
That's great.
And I only recently learned that Stephen Fry actually hosted the BAFTAs for a while. But not only that, he was involved in trying to get a posthumous BAFTA for Jeremy, but we tried to pick up that mantle, and man, that's been
keeps going nowhere.
Stone wall. Yeah, that's the BAFTA people do not want to go backwards. They do not want to look to the past.
I'm baffled. Well, tell us a little bit about what we have to expect from you from season 2. How frequently are new episodes coming out?
Well, that's a great question, because with our movie having just been released, we've been wearing a lot of hats, and it took quite a while to get The Empty House out. But I'm hoping to get back to a more regular schedule. We try to do one every 4 to 6 weeks. That doesn't always happen. The adventures we've had because of this podcast, if you listen to all the episodes, you may know, but we were traveling and got all of our gear stolen at one point, and while we were in London, actually. Had all our laptops, episodes were lost that we were working on, that kind of a thing. And so we've been kind of cobbling it together as we go along. But for us, it's a hobby, and it's a fun distraction from the film stuff that we normally do. And so I'm hoping that we'll get to the end of this season within a year. I think technically, the thing about the Granada show is, when are the seasons? You know what I mean? Like, there was a huge hiatus halfway between the David Burke episodes, which I call a season, but I guess some people don't. BritBox certainly doesn't. But the next season is technically only 7 episodes, but the return, I think, is more episodes than that. So I'm hoping we can get to at least those 7. I'm hoping we can get right up to maybe push against the Sign of 4 by the end of 1 year from when we started this season.
Final question for you guys. I know you rate each episode of the Granada series as how many is it?
Persian slippers.
Persian slippers. Yeah, I was going to say deerstalkers. Persian slippers. Now, do the same thing for us with your favorite podcast episode. Which one would you rank the highest? Which is your favorite episode?
Oh man, I have no idea. I haven't really gone back and thought about them too much. I probably would say The Final Problem, just because I feel like so much work went into it, because there was so much to talk about, so many transitions happening in the show. But it's fairly recent, so maybe that's why I feel that way. But I know that our favorite episode is The Solitary Cyclist. Both Luke and I tend to feel that way, and so if that was probably the most fun that we've ever had talking about an episode. Luke, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think Solitary Cyclist is the one we always recommend to people as like a jumping in point for the Jeremy Brett series. But that was so early in the recording. I feel like I wonder how it would be going back to that episode. But the Redheaded League is always one that I enjoy talking about, just because it's so weird. Just the story in general. I like that one a lot. It's fun, but it's weird, and there's some Moriarty, so it's dark. It's just a neat episode.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Gus Holwerda, Luke Holwerda, thank you both for joining us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And more importantly, thank you so much for doing the wonderful job that you do with the Sherlock Holmes Jeremy Brett podcast.
Well, thank you for providing us with information where we are lacking, and there are many places where that is the case.
Well, maybe we can be your unofficial consultants, unofficial consulting podcasters.
Perfect. Absolutely.
Perfect.
I love the fact that the podcast started, I think Gus and Luke said this sort of early on, that we used to just call each other. You know, we used to watch an episode and then just call each other and talk about it. And it's that wonderful instinct. You know, it's the same sort of instinct that Christopher Morley wrote about in a couple of his essays, but particularly in The Blue Carbuncle, where he said, you know, how are people going to know what all this is about? What's a basket chair? What's a pink gun? Unless we tell them. And I think the lovely thing about what Luke and Gus are doing is the balance, you know, the balance between the conversation that they have, that they're so good at, and the commentary. And one of the things we should mention too is that since we recorded this interview with them, they have now actually launched the first volume of their Relics collection, which I'm sure we'll have a link to in the show notes. And one of the things that's happened as an outgrowth of all of this is that I've started my irregular rewatching of all of the Jeremy Brett series. So earlier this week, I just watched Scandal and Bohemia again, and boy, oh boy, they really are wonderful.
They really are. They hold up over time, and they're like the stories themselves. You know, you can revisit them and have that kind of feeling of being wrapped in a warm old sweater that you've known for years. And you know, the thing about Gus and Luke that strikes me is it's very clear that they're providing a service in terms of documenting some references, almost verbally annotating the episodes for us, so we're brought into the inner circle. But at the same time, you can tell they're just personally passionate about this, and they bring that personal love of the show to the fore. And you know what? I'm sure when they started this out, they thought, well, there's a few other people out there, but this is something that we just like, and we just want to share our likes with the world. And it comes through again and again, every single episode. And in addition with the Relics collection, you know, they both identified, wow, they do some fantastic prop work on this show. Wouldn't it be amazing to own some of those props? And in the Sherlockian Relics collection, volume 1, they do just that. So we'll have a link to their Shopify site where you can sign up. It's a package deal, right? You get the Blue Carbuncle, you get a bottle of Radis Pedis Diaboli, the Devil's Foot Root. You get the Red-Headed League contract. You get a copy of the Musgrave Ritual, a Sign of 4 warning card, and a poster of the Falls of Reichenbach that was famously hanging over the mantle in 221B in all of those episodes leading up to the final problem. Little foreshadowing there.
Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle have been topics of conversation in the world of literature ever since 1895. Wouldn't it be great to look through all those discussions, have all those articles, reviews, and commentary in one place on your bookshelf? Now you can, because the Wessex Press has published Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, and the Bookman. All the pastiches, parodies, letters, all the columns and commentaries about Sherlock Holmes from 1895 to 1933, from the finest literary magazine of the 20th century, the Bookman, in one place, bringing back dozens of long-lost commentaries about the chronicles of Sherlock Holmes. Don't wait until this handsome volume is out of print. Get your copy of Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, and the Bookman right now at wessexpress.com.
Well, that music means that it is time for Canonical Couplets. That's right, it's everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show where we give you 2 lines of poetry and you need to identify which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about. In this case, we gave you this clue. That double line above the wrist most would not perceive. Still, Watson noted beads and fringe and plush upon the sleeve. Bert, do you know which canonical story we're talking about?
Yes, that was the case of the disguised old eccentric. That was the veiled codger.
Oh, so close. And yet not at all. No, we were going for a case of identity. Yeah. Although I will say our friend Eric Deckers once again has not let us down. He said, this one took me a minute. This was the mystery where Bert began wearing bow ties and Scott grew a mustache. It's a case of identity theft. No, sorry, that's my iHose fan fiction. Sorry, the case is, and then he gives us the correct answer. And I told Eric only one of those things happens in real life. Bert wearing a bow tie and Scott growing a mustache. And I'm not going to say which.
Well, that's true. Well, I love bow ties, but there you, yeah. Well, I don't know. You might look good in a goatee. You should start. Here's what you should do. You should start in Michigan by just finding 4 or 5 places where you could go change your appearance somewhere across town and then see what develops.
I could do that right here at home too. I don't even need to leave the house. This is the pandemic version of finding places to change costume. Well, anyway, speaking of identities, we do have a winner in this case, or we have a potential winner. We got a number of them lined up. So let's spin the big prize wheel here and see exactly who we are going to choose as the wheel slows down and lands on number 34. Number 34. All right, that corresponds to Vakis Potamianos. Vakis, congratulations to you. We'll be reaching out and getting in touch as we prepare to give you, a copy of 221B, BC. The Bert Cools and Michael Cox publication there about behind the scenes at the Clive Marison, Michael Williams BBC production. Congratulations to you. And now we have this week's Canonical Couplet, and before we get to it, just a teaser, we have a fabulous anonymous prize from the iHose vaults, because we can't give away a podcast this time. You know, we try to keep it in theme, but we have something for you from our vault. Something, a little outre. We're not going to tell you what it is, but if you would like to win it, make sure you are part of this week's Canonical Couplet. Here we go. The box of bricks suggested that the case was quite involved. This puzzle required an ounce of shag and cushions to resolve. If you know the answer to this week's Canonical Couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with Canonical Couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers submitted and we choose your name at random, you will win this fabulous prize. Good luck. All right. How is it that we've done this again, Bert?
I think it's just a tribute to our determination, you know?
It must be. It must be.
Other people would be presented, with 60, 70, 80, 90 minutes of time, and they would look at themselves and say, my goodness, what can I possibly do? Another walk around the block, rearrange my sock drawer. But no, we do this.
Well, maybe we'll rearrange our Sherlockian sock drawer at some point.
That's a great idea.
Well, one thing we do owe our listeners is another live episode. And as we get into November, I think we'll be scheduling that at one point or another. If you'd like to find out about that, the first to know will be the folks on Patreon and PayPal, the people that are supporting us. So if you'd like to do that, just go to ihearofsherlock.com and hit one of those support buttons. For as little as $1 a month, you can be in the know. You'll be the first to find out about new episodes, and when we're scheduling other things like this, that is the way to go. So hopefully we will take you through our own libraries, our own collections, as we invite you into our lives via video, and live video at that. So stay tuned. Also, before we go, I should note there has been some news about Sherlock Holmes 3, the untitled Robert Downey Jr. sequel. Evidently, it has hit a roadblock, according to CinemaBlend. Obviously, with the pandemic, lots of things are completely off kilter, and it was supposed to be released this Christmas season, and evidently it's been pushed up at least another year. So we'll have to wait before we see Robert Downey Jr. cross the screen again without Deerstalker. Well, that'll do it for us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We hope that you will subscribe either via email or the podcast player of your choice. Tell other people about the show. That's the best way for us to grow and to reach new ears for people that are interested in all things related to Sherlock Holmes. Until next time, I am the related Scott Monty.
And I'm the unclassifiable Burt Wolder.
And together we say... The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.